to have you in this podcast conversation, and we will get started shortly. We just want to give a moment for folks to log in here. Okay. So we've got like an hour that we're trying to do to keep this within. So we're really gonna try to keep it tight. I don't want to take up too much of people's time. We really appreciate y'all being here today. We to get started, like we're just gonna jump into it. Me and Marcus here are gonna riff, and I'm just gonna start us off here. So we'll both give introductions. I'm Deqah Hussein-Wetzel. I am an urbanist, a preservationist, a historian. I am a PhD student at Columbia in historic preservation, third year, and I am also the founder of Urbanist Media, which is the one of the nonprofits that's putting this event together along with Marcus's, and the host of the Urban Roots podcast. Okay,
Hello,
over to
everyone.
Marcus.
My name is Marcus Smith. I am a fifth year PhD candidate in the W.E. Du Bois Department of African American Studies. I'm also the founder of the Black Grassroots Heritage Preservation Network and the host of its podcast, Black Preservation Stories. So I'm excited to talk about place-based podcasting, and I'm very appreciative for everyone who took the time to join us today.
Yeah, so to kick us off, like first, I want to ask Marcus, what is your podcast about?
So, Black Preservation Stories focuses on grassroots efforts to preserve Black history across the United States, and this takes different forms. The preservation of Black churches, most often the development of museums, anti-gentrification and anti-displacement projects, as well as cultural arts initiatives and ceremonies of remembrance. And so I travel, I identify, and I interview. And then I take this process of then creating that into a podcast. And the idea was always to not only kind of share the personal narratives behind preservation work, provide insight into local community history, but also kind of activate the archives in a creative way that makes preservation accessible and perhaps provide some insight for others who are interested in engaging in preservation work, how other people with limited resources in those contexts and without preservation backgrounds were able to preserve their own histories.
And like who's your audience? Who are you speaking to?
This is actually a question, I think we talked about this a few times, that I've struggled with over and over and over again. Because theoretically, it's always great to say everyone, but practically, it's hard to design a podcast or approach it without having a specific audience in mind. So generally, I identify as those who are interested in Black history specifically, but also those more broadly who are interested in how Black history and memory work has worked towards contemporary and historical social justice causes. So I'm looking for people who are scholar activists, historian activists, local grassroots people. So that's my hope, and I hope that's who's tuning in. In addition to that, everyone I just mentioned.
Um, so I think that's like we got a lot of similarities between our podcasts, right?
Mm.
For me, the podcast ethos it's to be narrative, but I've been doing these interview based episodes, and that's been able to give us some bonus content in between seasons. The Urban Roots podcast is started off narrative by design and has evolved into being something that's both telling the story through utilizing oral histories, community members. It takes a lot of work, and we're on the ground doing so much to make the production possible, and that's me and my team. When I have started as a hobby with some of these folks, Connor Lynch and Vanessa Quirk, and then it evolved to trying to be something that we're able to make a little bit of money so we can hire help and actually make these podcasts uh, a little bit more, comprehensive and in depth, so that we can, not all be stretching ourselves too thin to do like both production, creative work, marketing, story editing, and like right what you're saying. So I think that matters, and the fact that like, well, Urbanist Media is a nonprofit, and um, what we do is essentially public work that we really want to build this community and have people feel like they're a part of this work. So I hope that's what we're doing.
Yeah, this is actually, and I'm very curious about this, Deca, because I think one thing that's unique about both our podcasts is that it's attached to a larger organizations, right? So it's not just the podcast as itself. You've got Urbanist Media and the Urban Roots Pod, and I've got BGHPN, Black Grassroots Heritage Preservation Network, and Black Preservation Stories. And so for you, I'm curious how it came about. Was it the podcast first and then the nonprofit, or did you have the nonprofit in mind and then you decided to do a podcast to showcase your work and how you get involved?
Yes, I love that question, because it was the podcast that came first. It was the work, the messaging, the way that I felt that at the time, like 2020, when this podcast came to fruition, I wanted it to be something that people could really listen to and interact with in a way that they weren't hearing other history podcasts do. And so because everything we're doing is essentially place-based, right? It's preservation. It's things in time and throughout time, and temporality is like kind of where we like to play with. So being able to do that for what ended up being the folks in the communities that we worked with, after they heard the podcast episodes, they were like, wow, thank you for telling our story right, and thank you for including us in the storytelling. That doesn't seem to be traditional practice when it comes to journalist type of work. Obviously there's the exceptions, and not everybody does it that way, but yeah, basically it was a labor of love that turned into something very meaningful. And then I wanted to start the nonprofit to help fill in certain gaps of African American history, uh, preservation, and planning.
Yeah, and I'm really curious about those gaps because one of the things we often talk about, or often just talk about a lot with podcasts, is that it's oversaturated or it's a saturated field. And so when you first started your podcast, what weren't you seeing that you felt needed to be told and that you specifically had the opportunity and skill set to tackle?
I don't think a lot of people were, well, I mean, at the time, I guess there was a lot of Black Lives Matter movement happening. So there was this transition to people becoming more like mindful of cultures, particularly Black culture. But I still felt that in preservation, that work was, it was just starting to ramp up. And I think that there needed to be a lot more people involved in the process of identifying certain historic places. And I think part of the work that I like to do is to find the history, the stories that make the whole narrative really make sense and work and be exciting to people who are listening to it. So like ultimately, like when I first started this, it was like my dream head, like, oh, like I'm making a podcast for, and this is actually where it gets really complicated because I'm not making a podcast for everybody, but I thought I was. And I was like, oh, the public is my audience. Public history does not equate to the entire public being your audience. There's going to be a niche of folks who are interested in either the story because it's place-based, like Cincinnati stories that we've done. A lot of folks in Cincinnati really vibe with that. And then there's this other work that we do that that I think in different places in different cities, and I think that can help people realize that a lot of these same historic trends, urban renewal, redlining, but also stories of really positive, inspirational African Americans who were the first doctors in their town, or first African American doctor, or first African American lawyer, or judge. These are stories that might get lost, and so I feel that there's also that need to fill that gap. And actually, I want to turn that back onto you, Marcus, right? Like, you are also filling a gap. Like, what is that gap, and why?
Yeah. So the origins of the BGHPN and the podcast, and it's kind of funny because they more or less developed at the same time. I had a mindset towards the idea of a community of grassroots preservationists who I felt were, or at least I've identified or noticed that were disconnected, both in personal testimony and just observation and experience from each other in terms of the stories that they were telling and why they're telling it and how were they using memory to do this work. And so for me, I was traveling across the country and I was just doing interviews of, for my own research of different grassroots museums. And at a certain point, I was in Maryland. I was in Maryland for 4 months. I said, well, if I'm working with this grassroots museum, I wonder if there are any others around here, ones who I could talk to, who can also get some context about not only what's happening here, but what's happening regionally. Because what I love to see is that if there's one grassroots museum in an area, there's likely to be another. And I felt that these individual efforts to preserve Black community history weren't really talked about, and the histories that they held were always fascinating. I recall an article by the late Fath Davis Ruffins called a Grassroots Museum of the Public Humanities. And she had spoken about how she believed the development of grassroots museums in the last few decades represented a larger, broader cultural movement. But then she also said something that stuck out with me is that and she was working on this article with the Association of African American Museums, where she said there's never been a proper accounting of the grassroots museums that exist. And her estimation, I believe, was somewhere around 400, which actually ends up being the number that is on the interactive map. It's 400, give or take. So yeah, and I felt that all these local community histories were really powerful and they're being told. And so I felt I wanted to every time I heard one, I felt this, I wish everyone could hear this. And the podcast became a medium of that. And then, which also influences my style as a kind of a traditional sit down interview style. And I'm curious if you could speak more about yours as because mine is very like I'm sitting down, I'm talking to an interview, where yours is I feel is a bit more holistic, and how you decided to take that approach versus the my name is Marcus, tell me I have questions for you kind of approach that I've taken.
Right. I mean, don't get me wrong. A lot of it is, oh yeah, I'm Zach. I have questions for you, and
Yeah.
it evolves into a lot of interviews. So it's a lot of interviews like that. I'm super curious, so I want to understand the places that we're investigating, like, but really from the people who live there. And we obviously try to bring in experts and stuff when necessary to help kind of balance it. But there is this tension, like, period, between historic preservation or really research in terms of oral histories, and then like the validity of that. Of oral histories are not always like, while in like thinking of archival work and thinking about the way people do use oral histories, they have been a method for a long time. But what happens is that as we are working through historic preservation and trying to like talk about like places that are listed on the National Register and stuff like that, when it comes to writing those types of nominations, oral histories aren't really used that much. And I felt that kind of what I do is almost bringing some of these things together. We got oral histories, and we can also say that these oral histories are true because the people who live there and talking about these stories are talking from their experience. So it's true off of their experience. And so that oral histories, archival, well, since it's audio mostly, it's a lot of archival audio, different things that to help piece it together. And then this narrative work is the stuff that like this American life is built off of. And so that's, I think at the time I remember looking it up, it would be like $60,000 per episode or something like that. And like that's right. Like that's how much time it costs to take. Yeah, if we could only have that kind of money. But yeah, I mean, that really, it's about like reclaiming and restoring these lost narratives, but like doing it with authenticity behind it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I really love the way you phrase that, because I think for me, a lot of times there is the oral history as interview, But a lot of times I try to make the effort to interweave when they're available oral histories in archives as part of the episode, either as an intro or as kind of as side points. And I think that's important because when we think about archives, I've always felt, and this often happens for a lot for Black communities in particular, that people donate their materials to a museum and there's no clarity about when those materials will be on display. Will they be during Black History Month? If so, how long? What is the community relationship they have through that archive? And so fundamentally, it's almost erasure by neglect. You might as well not even have the objects if you never show them. And I feel the same
Yeah.
way about oral histories, that they are so significant, but often they are seen as a lesser historical record. So for me, part of it is, okay, how do I, in that same logic, how can I take the oral histories that I've seen and activate them in a way that people will listen to them? How do I make them available? In some ways, I would even consider it, depending on how you do your podcast, the podcast itself as an exhibit of oral histories that
Yeah.
is broadly accessible to the public. And so that's always been my mindset, is like, how can I do a traditional oral history, but applying a creative lens toward it and a creative editing in order to make it accessible and directly enjoyable in ways people increasingly like to consume media. Because I haven't really seen oral history exhibits. And that's what I kind of
Mm.
feel with this historical grounding that podcast is attempting to do. Because I feel when we talk about the word podcast, people have a really kind of broad range of assumptions. They think of like Joe Rogan, they think of entertainment podcast or football podcast or sports podcast more broadly, I should
Mm.
say. And it really kind of, it kind of diminishes one, the possibility of an audio format. Let's just forget podcast for a second. Audio as scholarship, um, and and as a medium to communicate. Because what to me, what is podcasting about? It's about communication. And what does communication serve? It serves as the ability to create empathy and build community between different groups. So that's what I hope the podcast is able to achieve in the long term through conversations like we're having now. And I try to think about it that way. And something else you said stuck out to me. I'd love to your turns about who your audience is, and I
Hmm.
think that derives perfectly into the question of what is your definition of a success of a successful podcast or even a successful episode? Because I've had to challenge myself and rethink that over since I started a year ago.
Yeah, I don't think that if you asked me this question 4 years ago, I would have the same answer I do now. I think I always feel like it's about the messaging, like that's about getting what we can out to the folks who are listening. Audience numbers used to mean a lot more to me than they do now, just because we are in a plethora of other podcasts that may or may not be better. Like they may or may not be like, necessarily I try to put a lot of value into like the quality of the podcast that we are providing. But again, not everybody is our audience. So I think what matters to me most is hearing feedback. Actually, I do not think people do this as much as I wish they did. And maybe it's because our audience is a lot of like non-traditional podcast listeners, but I really wish folks would like drop us a line, like email I mean, if you have my number and you're listening to something, like I love to know what people actually think. I mean, this goes to why I think the ratings and the reviews are so important in the actual podcast space, because we need to have people review and all that stuff, give us ratings so that we can bump up and be like more visible on like the Apple podcasts or Spotify podcasts. And I don't think a lot of people understand or know that, especially, if you're not in the podcast game, then you're not necessarily understanding what you can do to help uplift another person's podcast. And maybe people don't have time. I mean, I get it. But ultimately, yeah, I think people's feedback, the comments, and what I can hear from folks. So Urban Roots Podcast at gmail.com if you guys want to drop me a line.
Hmm.
I do like hearing people's feedback.
I do like it as well. So Marcus at bghpn.org. And I think this
Yeah.
actually gets us to this space of kind of stepping back a little and defining how do you think about the characteristic of what a place-based podcasting is, but also place-based storytelling. Because With respect to you said, I think that I've also had to change this past year about how important numbers to me. And I'm never going to say I don't want as many listeners as possible, but one of the things that stuck out to me is that there might be an episode that doesn't get a lot of listens, and sometimes I'll know that going in, which is the hard part, right? Where there's a site that doesn't have a large social media presence, or don't really have the capacity to promote the episode in ways that would be ideal. But coming from the logic that every story matters, every community matters, it's putting the same amount of effort, sometimes more effort depending on the challenges that the episode provides. But one of the things that I think about with respect to audience and success is that, like, there's one episode where I think about where it didn't have many, but every person in the community who was attached to that space really did listen to it. And they emailed me with their feedback about how they sat down as a family and listened to the episode together, and it warmed their hearts and things like that, right? And so it's like not only who is my audience, but fundamentally thinking if we do, coming from the nonprofit say see our podcast as advocacy, it's not just a question of who is our audience, but who do we think our podcasts are for. And when we have that, I think that episode in place, knowing that there's a relationship to the community and that there's a relationship to the story that's being told, that makes me feel more secure that I think that good work is being done. And so I've got more to, I think, say about that, but I'm curious, like, how do you define or understand both the benefits, but even some of the challenges of place-based podcasting?
Yeah. No, place-based podcasting essentially for me means that we are grounded in a particular place within the built environment. Um, but because there's been so much erasure in historically black places, then that's that hence that term place-based. So it's not saying like we're just talking about a site or whatever. And I think that individual communities, they require trust. People, there's this level of trust building that we have to do to be able to engage with anyone, whether it's a collaborator in a museum or talking to folks on the street, people within the neighborhood that we're trying to learn more about, developers that we want to talk to. I mean, it is like it's a lot of work. It's just like an
Yeah.
excessive amount of work to be able to accomplish what we have. And so like I'm proud that we're able to find those ways to have conversations with people that feels true and like not exploitative, or is that a word? Yeah, so I don't want to
Yeah.
be exploiting anybody that we're interacting with. And honestly, I feel like what you said really resonates with me, and I really want to hear about how you feel about that work that you're doing to build the relationships and how that feeds into the larger work that you're doing with BGHPN, and maybe talking a little bit more
Yeah.
about that org.
Yes, thank you. Um, so, I have two thoughts about this. I think one thing I was thinking about before entering this conversation is that it's important to me to say that, like, I think even though our methodology is place-based podcasting, that it's our place-based storytelling, that it doesn't mean that someone who doesn't have the resources to travel or to do this can't tell a great story or and a meaningful story, even in an equal way. Because one of the things I think about as an example of this, I've done 15 episodes so far, hopefully more to come. And I think it's a fun fact that for that most I think don't make it past seven because it's like how much work goes into the podcasting. A lot of it took me by surprise as well. Um, and I've done like in different states for it, and I've done all of those. But every single I've done 15 episodes, but it was only one which I did not do in person. And that was the Finn Glendale and Public Housing Coalition in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I say that to point out, even though that was the only episode I didn't do in person, it's still to this day the most successful episode. Interestingly enough. But I think what was key about that is that, and one of the things I like to say is that the conversation before and after the interview is often, equally important, if not more so, to the actual interview itself. So in that case, there was someone else who was able to connect me to Defend Glendale Public Housing Coalition, to schedule, to talk about BJHPN and the preservation podcast more broadly, to schedule a meeting on Zoom that lasted about 2 hours, talking about like my methodology, ensuring that this release form ensures that you're co-author to this story, that I'm not affiliated, even though I'm currently at UMass, this is not a project of the university, right? And so part of I think place-based storytelling is not necessarily always just being there in place, but ensuring that there is some relation in place that can be an interlocutor or help facilitate telling a story and ensuring that trust is there. And so I've started, and I've thought about this especially going into the organization at large, where last year when I started the podcast, it was part of my work where I had the opportunity to travel to 20 states. Like it wasn't a big deal for me to, schedule something in Alabama or wherever. Now I'm in Massachusetts, so really I don't have the capacity to travel much except for the New England area. I mean, the far as I'll go usually is like a 6 hours one way before I'm like, okay, I gotta I'm out of this. And so the feasibility of doing place-based podcasting, as I traditionally thinking about it, like I have to be there, is no longer like, is that sustainable and is that feasible for, especially if you want a consistent publication schedule? The answer to me is no. But the and so I need to be more creative about how I think about place-based storytelling with my method. To this broader point about how it spoke to the organization, well, one of the things that was important to me is that I really wanted to make sure that there was a face to the name, that I showed up in a room, because there's some things that you just like. There's nothing like and being at a place, and then even outside the interview, you see this kind of excitement that appears on their face, and like that kind of harkens to childhood when they're talking about this history or this place. And there's nothing like seeing that rage or that frustration when they see injustice written into their built environment. And oftentimes those are very informative to those questions, but they're essential, whether they make sense to interview or not, to understanding the person, their community, and then making that relationship. So every single person, except for one or two instances, who was now on the BJHPN board of directors, was a person who I interviewed for the podcast, right? So I've always said during the interview that it's the first conversation, not the last. And on a large level, that's been true. There's very few interviews where when I interviewed them a year ago, we're still not talking to this day, because being about place-based is understanding I have a mutual investment community. And I'll summarize by saying this. One of the things I think about in terms of being place-based is that there's a quote from George Jackson who said, "You can't turn back of awareness, or from awareness." And when you're in a community and they see that you're aware, right? You know that you're aware, that there's a certain moral responsibility that you take upon yourself, hopefully, and that you, in a kind of moral vision and ethos you share with the communities you're working with, that comes across not only how you interact, but in your work. And I think that has been, so the interviewing, the conversations, has been essential to the development of the community, the board, and advisory board, and so on, that is now BJHP, and I hope, as we go into our second year, our first anniversary being May 22nd, last week. So I put the story in history, so that's a long-winded answer to your
Yeah.
brief and elegant question.
Oh no, that was great, because I think that goes back to why the nonprofit work, like it's that we start a conversation, we engage, and I mean, I like building friendships, and then I don't like to let them go. Like I am like holding on so tight. Like I moved to New York, and I'm trying so hard to make sure I'm maintaining as many relationships as I can, like in my personal life. And then I'm also trying to do that in my professional life. And I think also this is a good place for us to talk about the other life that we have, which is our PhD work.
Oh,
And before,
that thing.
yeah, that little thing. Before I get there, I want to let everybody know that if you're just joining us, hello, I'm Deqah, and I'm here with Marcus, and we would love for you guys to make sure that you're putting down some questions in the engaging in the feed, but also like after you have any questions, we'll open that up for folks to be able to engage with us, especially if you're in the actual room with us. We have a webinar room. If you're on YouTube, sorry, no, I'm kidding. You could engage live in the chat in YouTube as well. We're managing everything here, but also like we are saying that it is important for us to hear from you. So please do engage with us. Okay, so Marcus, tell me all about your PhD work in your world, and why did you start doing it, and what does it evolve to, and how does it relate back to everything you're doing now?
Now that is a season of podcast itself. Let
Yeah, I
that
might have
journey.
asked you like a
Yeah,
15-part question.
Yeah. So I think I'm challenged to be succinct, but I'll do my best here. So my research specifically focuses on the development of grassroots museums in the historical and rural South. So I was doing that research, doing 3 months of living in Maryland, Florida, and Mississippi, working with and living in the communities where these grassroots museums are being developed. And I think, speaking to what I said earlier, that develops a lot of my emphasis on wanting to do things in person or really focused on place in that way. And so the BGHPN in a lot of ways is actually an outgrowth of that research of that fieldwork. 1 year of living and working in relative isolation, traveling across the country, talking to different grassroots museums, and then pitching them BGHPN at a certain point at the same time doing the interview. So my research is directly intertwined, and so a lot of the times, and funny enough, I've even been able to mention BGHPN in my dissertation, kind of in a tongue-in-cheek way. I remember one of my dissertation committee people asking me, it's like, okay, Marcus, I know you're focused on grassroots museums, but can you tell me like how many there are, where they're located, what they tell me? I'm like, yes, and I just send him a link to the BGHPN website and the interactive map, and it's like, there you go. And then so I mentioned like so I'm able to use that data and that experience um, directly in my dissertation in kind of useful ways and in ways I'm very thankful for. So I'm very grateful that the work is inseparable. The more I learn doing the BGHPN podcast, the more insight I have in order to analyze, one or like the 4 or 5 sites who are the focus of my dissertation. And I'll say this very simply: how I came to this. It's by accident, but also by intention. I think by kind of like my steps were ordered in that way. So my great grandma or my grandmother, she would go to our great grandparents' house, which is a historic property, and she would say 2 things. She would say, "Give us the oral history of our family. This house was owned by your great grandfather J.C. Purnell, his wife Ella Purnell, who had daughters, me. And she would do that, and then she would also secure from the grandchildren who are like 10, who don't know anything about historic preservation. I just want to play my PS2. I don't know anything about any of this. Promises never to sell the property. So it started that way. And that is my family's hometown is from Canton, Mississippi, which has a lot of significance as a civil rights hub of the civil rights movement. And then one day, and I had no really appreciation of that town growing up. To me, it was just a small town. And it's a rural town. I'm growing up in Houston, Texas, in an urban city. And then one day, I see that the Canton Freedom House Civil Rights Museum had popped up, 2011, 2012. And I walked inside there, and that was pretty much the first time really I had seen on a really personal level. I was aware of the civil rights history, but on a personal level about the involvement of that community, and it filled me with such pride. And I learned that my grandfather, for example, his name was in the Mississippi Department of Archives and History as someone who had registered to vote because the Citizens Council had written his name when he went to go vote, and I decided to interview him. And the things that he was telling me about his involvement in the civil rights movement, his struggles growing up, what he hoped for the community, and what he saw as important for the museum, kind of led me toward this path of like, well, if it's happening in my hometown, and if my great grandmother's name matters, because she picked cotton in the field, never had a sixth grade education, and took shifts in the cotton field so my grandfather could go to school more regularly. And I would not be here without that small act of love and that sacrifice that she had, if you think about it as a domino effect. If my story, if my community matters, if my elder matters, then everyone's community, everyone's elder matters. And therefore, every effort to preserve it matters. And so that kind of drove me to study grassroots museums, but also to take the interview I had done. I've interviewed my own family for their own genealogy and life history, and then apply it to the podcast format, which I hope to do with and other communities in organizations as I go forward. So that's my origin, and that's my dissertation in that way.
Oh,
So I'm
nice.
curious your story here, Deqah.
Oh, like with the PhD program. Yeah, I think because I started the podcast before I started the PhD program, I just had all these ideas and these thoughts, and I was able to take some of the things that I was thinking about maybe theoretically and put it into practice a little bit. And so I was starting to see these connections be made, this way of amplifying places that people are not as familiar with, but also like really thinking about this as harm repair. Like, how can we use storytelling as a way to repair the damage that's been done on America, period? And I say America because my work is focused on Black America. I would love to evolve my area of expertise to also be grounded in like the African diaspora and my culture and my well, I was born in Buffalo, New York, but I am first generation American and my family is Somali. And we also have roots in Kenya. And so I always felt that I had a cultural identity. And I think that also being a Black person in America makes it also, I don't know, like at this point, I'm like feel a little despondent about it all, but I I I think that what I've been doing with the podcast is like it's trying to take on these new experimental forms of preservation. And I really want to lay that foundation in the PhD spectrum. Like I want to be that person for folks to go to out there and with questions about not just preserving places that are significant to people of color, but also the storytelling work. And like I would love for folks to reach out to me and say, you know, would you give a workshop on how to do some of this place-based community engagement when it comes to storytelling? Because I see a lot of people out there who are trying to tell stories that are places that are not where they're from, and I think there's a little bit of a barrier to doing that. And also like we want to be we want to, like for me as an academic, I also don't want to engage just like going in and doing one thing and then leaving. And I
Yeah.
think that that's a bit of a tension that I'm going to be dealing with, because right now I am actively dealing with my qualifying exams and really diving into the literature that is also like all these other people are doing these different and yet similar type of work in preservation, whether it comes to like trying to do harm repair, whether it's engaging with the grassroots communities, like what you're doing. I mean, you obviously would know better than me too. In a lot of ways, there is quite a lot of a literature out there that does speak to some of these things that we do. But I think that what we're contributing dives in a little bit deeper and really connects things in a way that I think is integral to what I hope and like I can be contributing to the preservation field and the preservation community. And I would
Yeah.
also say that Columbia was the first to start a PhD preservation program. So I think in terms of specifically preservation, there there are people who do work in like urban spaces and African American history, but perhaps with this, you know, new wave of doctoral work and preservation, I think we can maybe start to really connect that built environment to the, you know, I don't know why I'm saying using this means more. My little son, he's like more, more. But no, like connecting the disciplines and being like well rounded. So like for me, I engage with uh, all sorts of different departments at Columbia that I'm working with, and including the oral history department. And I'm taking classes in all of these places. And so I would say that I don't have quite the answer of like to what I am doing and what it's going to become, but I really do hope my dissertation can really lean to filling in these gaps that
Yeah.
are, I mean, historically, like it might be a little bit more now, but a few years ago it was 2% of places listed in the National Register of Historic Places were places that were tied to Black America. So that, I mean, that's just a fundamental issue that we have in preservation, and it's a very white space. And
Mm.
I I hope that I'm trying to
Yeah.
change in some ways to make it more inclusive by not just like being a person of color, but doing the work that comes along with where I feel like I'm making a contribution.
Yeah. And I think you made a point that I definitely wanted to double on is that, like, the question that some people might ask themselves is, why a podcast over an oral history? Not that say that they're mutually exclusive, because I treat my interviews as oral history, then turn them into
Hmm.
podcasts. But when I when I when I think about it, is I think it's inherently that the issue of extraction, because a lot of communities are reluctant to do interviews, and, and even the people I've interviewed in the past, because someone will do an oral history interview, and then they'll never see how that interview has been used. They'll never have access to it. If it gets transcribed, it's in an archive somewhere, and it may not be archived at somewhere that's immediately accessible. And I'm not going to go as far as to say that that podcasting is avoids that extraction entirely, but it does something by making that immediately public from the get-go. And also, it allows for collaboration about how to tell a story rather than how to, rather than just having something in archive. So I think in some ways, in both annoying ways, for me, and but it's been very important ways, the podcast is somewhat counter academic. I mean,
Yeah.
certainly, no one in academia has really complimented me on the podcast or spoke about its value as a research method, right? But that's the point, I think, because the fact that it's people taking traditional scholarship or traditional methodology and applying it in a way that is inherently accessible and less ivory towered, if you will. So how do we make knowledge accessible? I think podcasting is one of those many forms. The same way I feel about digital humanities in general, whether it be interactive mapping or whether it be about publishing articles online or even Instagram reels, right? Ways to transmit and communicate knowledge through different mediums. And so that's what I kind of see the work we're doing with respect to whatever our dissertation or research might be more broadly.
Yeah. No, I think that I love that. And I'm okay, as an academic, I'm going to tell you, I love what you're doing. I think what you're doing is fabulous.
I
So, I
appreciate it.
mean, I don't
And as
have
an
to,
academic, let me tell you.
yeah, I think the like the value of what we do is beyond what we like what we see and what we know. Like there is a lot of people who are listening to this and taking note. And I've got a lot of episodes out there. I have not counted, and I probably should. But like 50 some, I mean, there's a lot. And a lot of them are like the interviews with people who are doing this type of practice, preservation planning, or black architects, like the type of practice in the field. And there is so much that people out there can learn about not like just like place, but like about how people are dealing with real life challenges, like gentrification, still a real life everyday struggle. We have that in New York. We've got that in Cincinnati. We have it in pretty much every city in America that I can think of that's got a big metropolis. And there's the stories are not the same everywhere. And I think like when you're talking about counter academic, I also feel like that counter narrative, the counter archive is almost in some ways what we're building, because you're recording the oral histories, right? But also the podcast in and of itself becomes an archive. And I
Yeah, and it's
utilize like all this stuff. Like I go back and I listen to like episodes from Cincinnati early on, and I'm like doing work, and when I was doing research on different things in Cincinnati, and I would like listen to these episodes so I can like go back and kind of remember and hear again from the people that were there. Like, so I am making sure that I'm doing the work to try to identify the places that are significant to the people.
Yeah. And you said it, something that's so you're absolutely right. And I've always, from the very beginning, thought about the podcast and also what I want to do with the BJHPN more broadly as an archive. So I always joke to people that let's say there are 400 sites on the map that are doing grassroots preservation work or cultural memory work. I always say I've got 15 interviews and I've got 375 more to go, because the goal is not also in the long term, not just to have the audio, but I really do want to get to a position to be able to transcribe, which is also in the release forms as well that I ask people to sign, to be able to have an archive of these sites in these community histories. And that's what's really key, because it's impossible to talk about a preservation project without getting into the history and the arc of that community's history over time. So I want to be able to have that digitally available as an archive of Black community histories and and the work that people have done to preserve it or commemorate it. So that's the long-term goal, and I hope I get there. But one thing you said stuck out to me, which is you said you have about 50 episodes, and I think eventually we have to get to the dirty word, which is sustainability. So
Mm.
how have you approached? Because like as I mentioned earlier, that statistic about most people don't even get past 7 episodes, but now you're at 50. So how did your mindset change between like what was your mindset when you first started the work, and how did your mindset change about sustainability now that you're here years later?
Yeah, I think it's something I touched on a little bit earlier, where I feel that the podcasts that we're doing are, they started off narrative. They started off me being like, I am not doing an interview based podcasts. I don't want to just have one person that I feature for an entire hour. I always used to think of those types of, like, I wasn't planning to develop my work in that way, but I did, and then it actually was something that, from the folks that did reach out to let us know, that was something folks were valuing. They then were able to understand how things work from a different place. So I our audience might be preservationists, architects, people of color, people who value the built environment, but we want to also create a podcast that can be relatable and can be understandable to everyone. So I do try to, like, not use a lot of excessive language, like uh just like, I want to say like erudite language, but that's exactly the word I'm trying to avoid using, is like, being very intentional with the way that I speak to my audience, because I just want us to all feel like we're on the same level, and I want us to feel like we're all in community and in conversation, even if I'm just maybe the one person on the one end, and then I do have a guest. So it has evolved, and I think I just have to be okay with that. Like, I've just rolling with the punches at this point, because I have so many frustrations with the podcast industry right now. It is like, it makes my blood boil, and I truly I think I'm in like a very personal, reflective period where I'm trying to understand also, like, what does the future look like of urban roots, and what what can I what can I do with the time that I have, as in, folks who might be joining this may personally know me. I am a new mom. I have a 9-month-old son, and I don't have any time. So I have to figure out, what it looks. Do I want to be trying to absolutely publish something once a month? Do I want to take a hiatus so I can really do the work that needs to be done on the editing side and all of that? There's so much background that we do. So, like, I don't know. I mean, that's how I feel. How about you? Like, it, it's hard.
Yeah, yeah, and there's so I in a perfect world I would publish bi-weekly, but that's not
Mhm.
really possible for a variety of reasons and a lot of good reasons, because it's hard because it takes time to develop trust. It takes time to do research, and it takes time to really kind of understand what the context of the story. And so I have given myself a bit more grace about not publishing as frequent. Because the thing I have to remind myself of often is that my goal is not to have a podcast for entertainment. My goal is to
Mm.
tell meaningful stories, and the goal is also for the story I tell to be meaningful for those who are the narrators or the subjects of that particular interview, right? And so it's not something that it's like, and so that pressure, that kind of, I think, moral responsibility is more of a pressure and more of what I think about than I have to publish this week, otherwise I'm going to lose momentum. Because the thing is, once again, I may not have the maximum amount of listeners that I wanted because I'm publishing inconsistently, but it goes back to what I said earlier about who was the podcast for. But everyone who was featured in that podcast in their community will listen regardless of when it's published, right?
Mm.
And so trying to hold on to that, I think, and realizing that has given me more freedom about how often and how regularly I publish. And and this kind of makes me think, and I wanted to ask you this because my content, or the interviews, it's like an hour long usually. Some episodes go to an hour and 15. And you started doing shorts recently, because I also think it's
Yeah.
important to not every interview has to be like this long hour long behemoth. So what influenced that decision for you to start doing shorts, and how have you felt about engaging in that work? um,
I love that question. Because you're right. Like, I've been engaging in shorts, and I have not mentioned that. And you just actually literally asked the question. I didn't even mention that because I sometimes feel that it's a confusing podcast space to say, like, we're doing shorts. What does that look like? On YouTube, we could do shorts that have some video over it. But what really was the most successful thing that we've done is engaging with Cincinnati Public Radio to do Juneteenth Cincinnati shorts. And so radio shorts is actually what we are meant for. Like, there's, I mean, we'll drop a link in the feed here, so for folks to listen if they haven't. But essentially, it's like a mini 90-second bite-sized history, and it's narrative in design. So it's not as comprehensive, and it doesn't necessarily always engage or bring in the voices of the folks from the community. But we do try when we can. But because it's so short, those do have to be really like tight. And with the Cincinnati Public Radio stuff that we do, we also do a 1 hour feature. And so this is Juneteenth work that we've done for the past 4 years. And this year we're doing it again. And it's going to be, this year's actually really neat. We did a little poll to see like what people wanted as content for, they voted. And it was between Black architects and Green Book sites, and Green Book sites won. And so we're developing content for this year in June. And will be published on Cincinnati Public Radio, and then we'll put it on our feeds afterwards. But the short form content it's useful and it's really neat, but I haven't seen a lot of people grab onto that. Like, I would love to see more radio stations engage with us. We've reached out to a number of them too, to say, hey, this is something we've started to create this formula with, and we would love to play around. And if there's histories that you wanted to uplift in your city, that we can help drive that. And of course it is for us, again, place-based, but that doesn't mean that we can't just talk about a person. We're really just like, we're talking about, for example, Sarah Fawcett, an African-American woman from Cincinnati, from the 1800s. In about 1870s, late 1800s, she was a key and a person to integrate the streetcar in Cincinnati. And her story it's tied to place, because streetcar was a big contributor to motion and place and how people are traveling and existing. But she also was, her and her husband founded an African-American church in a neighborhood called South Cumminsville. Now, the church, at the time that we were doing the work around this, the church wasn't like, I don't think it was quite 50 years old. So it was sort of like, historic preservation wise, there hasn't, nobody has written a nomination to preserve it or anything like that at the time. I had previously done some work to help create a historical marker, working with some other groups, but there wasn't a lot of ways that her story was recognized. And just because a place isn't 50 years of age, like, that doesn't mean that it's not significant. And then also, when we're dealing with erasure, like, so, but again, the shorts are short, right? So we do really try to focus on the uplifting bits, and then if we can have that companion narrative longer form piece, then we try to explain more there. I guess I'd also want to say that, like, on our YouTube, we have a couple videos that I made well, some also with the help of especially Connor, who's our editor. But the videos were about Cincinnati's Black history, the West End neighborhood, and then one about urban renewal. And I didn't really do any marketing for those, but like the urban renewal video has like 30,000 views or something like that, right? So it's sort of like there is something to the idea of putting imagery and video to the audio, but then it makes our work like 10 times harder. So it's always like
Yeah.
a juggle. I
Yeah.
don't know. Like what, and so what do you think? Like what do you think you want to do moving forward?
I know I do want to get more in shorts. It's one of those things where I still want to keep my focus on grassroots sites, but I also want something to be less demanding. Or I want to have something in companion to the podcast episode. And often I try to write articles that I go alongside it to showcase the photography, audiograms, and sometimes videos that I take while I'm at sites. But I want, and that's what. So right now I have audiograms, but I don't think that's which I do like as teasers and as themes. But I really want to find a way to, like, I'll put it this way: I've got there's 400 sites on the map, and I'm not going to interview them all immediately, but I would still love to give a short narrative comment about, hey, this site does that. Like, have you, like, in the same way you go to Instagram, it's like, hey, have you heard of this? And so I want to be able to highlight sites on the map through short form content, even though I haven't had a chance to interview them yet, as a way to, like, both start that engagement, that conversation, that community, but as a way to also show people that we're invested not just on who we've been able to interview and we have access to, but every story beyond just the map. So how can I take the map, because I think the map is the core. How do you take the data on the map and then turn that into long form interviews? How do you take the data on the map and then turn it into short form audio or video content? How do you turn them into articles? Think how do you use that as a way to build community? Because I only know who the grassroots projects are to interview. So they're often not on the state websites or something like that because of the map, right? And so it's I see everything as interconnected in that way, and that's what I want to start getting to once I have the keyword capacity um, in the future.
Yeah.
So yeah.
No, that's great. We've got a few more minutes here, and I really want the idea of this community driven, work. We want to hear it from you guys out there in the community, like those who are actually engaging and watching this now. What are your takeaways? Like what do you feel about your community? What do you feel about the work that's being done there? I actually know some of the folks I'm seeing here in the chat are other people who are like academics, historians, people doing this work. So you guys feel free to put it in the chat, or if you figured out how to, like, we can unmute you or whatever, but the chat will probably be the easiest way.
Yeah, and I would also just love to connect if you ever wanted to talk one on one or just share information. And so I'm gonna put my information in there as well.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, and while I'm waiting for folks to put some stuff in there, I wanna like commend Marcus for for
That's
all
very
the,
kind.
like, you dude, you are constantly interviewing people in person. Like that is like you're going around doing that. You're doing the editing. You're doing a lot of this on your own. You've just started out with this work, and I think for me, connecting with you recently, because we have this shared idea of what we want to see made possible with the mapping and stuff. Like, I want folks out there to know that me and Marcus are working behind the scenes here. We've been applying for grants. We've been trying to do all sorts of things so that we can
Yeah.
bring our work in really important conversations with each other, so that the mapping can work with the storytelling and in all these different ways. So stay tuned, but also, like, then again, the reason I was commending Marcus is because he's really doing a lot of this with him and one of his partners that I think Samira, who helps out a lot and is also a fellow Somali, and that's
Shout out to
actually
Samir.
so shout out to Samira, my sister, because I mean, like, I before I got to know you, you were already working on the Glendale episode, and you were diving into Somali communities, and like that was one of the things that really grabbed me, right? I'm like, oh, I'm seeing this podcast and this guy going and, talking to folks that uh, look and are more like myself, who aren't necessarily like, we are American, but there is a different kind of black culture that comes into play when we're talking about different like African diaspora cultures.
Yeah.
So yeah, yeah.
And I'll say just, well, I'm sincerely appreciative and thankful for that affirmation. And I will say, you said something earlier that I very much align with. Like, I know it's called, the Black Grassroots Heritage Preservation Network, but I'm also very mindful about wanting to include diverse histories of Afro descendants and people in that diaspora. And so a lot of it's been focused on museums, but I'm interested in talking about music, about religion and theology. And so as we go into the next year for BJHP, what's next for us is trying to figure out the stories that we haven't captured with respect to the diversity that we want to showcase and that is there, um, in whatever format we can: audio, written, visual. So I hope people will stay tuned for that, and I'm interested in what's next. Well, I know you mentioned the Juneteenth shorts, so I'll be staying tuned for those, for
Yes.
Urbanist Media.
Oh yes, we have a newsletter on Substack, Urbanist Media. And I want to say to everybody, thank you for joining us. And we do have one comment here. So somebody doing the similar type of heritage preservation work, and they're saying trial and error for us mostly. There are no
Yeah,
books that could cover all aspects of our work. So we have to be flexible, right, to grow in the different communities. And I think that is
yeah,
so true. Yeah.
yeah. And I'll add the scent to that by saying, like, this is the community is not pretty. We're gonna make mistakes collectively. We're gonna say things we shouldn't. We're going to want to do things faster than sometimes community wants to move. And I've made mistakes. I'm learning from that, and I hope we can all um, learn and make mistakes together towards something great. So I appreciate everyone who's given me their time and their patience, both here and outside. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all. All right, we don't want to take up too much more of your time. So thank you for joining us.